Nobody noticed the orphan Omega until the day her name appeared on a list that should never have existed. Evelyn Hart stood perfectly still as the parchment fluttered in the cold morning breeze outside the eastern gate of Moonhaven City. The paper was pinned to a weathered wooden board where announcements, work assignments, and legal notices were posted for everyone to see. Most people walked past without a second glance. Others stopped only long enough to confirm that their own names were not there. Evelyn couldn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on a single line near the bottom. Evelyn Hart, age 21. Omega, unclaimed, scheduled for relocation at month's end. The words blurred for a moment before sharpening again. Relocation. It sounded polite, harmless, but everyone knew what it meant. Unwanted Omegas from overcrowded territories were quietly transferred to distant settlements where labor was needed and questions were rarely asked. Some returned years later. Most never did. Around her, the city continued as if nothing had happened. Merchants rolled carts across the cobblestone streets. Bakers opened their doors, filling the crisp air with the smell of fresh bread. Noble carriages rattled toward the royal district. Life moved forward. Evelyn seemed to stop. She lowered her gaze and wrapped her thin gray cloak tighter around herself. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Orphan, Omega, poor. Those three words had followed her for as long as she could remember. She had learned years ago that people saw them before they ever saw her. To the city, she wasn't Evelyn. She was simply another forgotten girl occupying space no one wanted to notice. A group of young women passed nearby wearing elegant festival dresses in shades of silver and blue. Their laughter echoed through the square. Tonight was the Moon Festival, the largest celebration of the year. Every noble house would attend. Every powerful alpha would gather beneath the palace lights. Even Alpha King Damian Blackthorne himself was expected to appear. Excitement filled the city like electricity before a storm. Evelyn should have been excited too. Instead, she stared at the relocation notice and wondered where she would be 1 month from now. 1,000 miles away perhaps. Somewhere no one knew her name. Somewhere no one would miss her. Child. The voice startled her. Evelyn turned and saw an elderly woman standing beside a fruit cart. The woman leaned heavily on a wooden cane, her silver hair tucked beneath a dark shawl. Her pale eyes studied Evelyn with unusual intensity. "Are you all right?" the woman asked softly. Evelyn managed a small smile. "I'm fine." It was the answer she always gave. The woman did not seem convinced. Her gaze lingered for several seconds before drifting upward to Evelyn's face. Then something changed. The color drained from her expression. Her fingers tightened around the cane. For a brief moment, she looked genuinely frightened. "Those eyes," she whispered. Evelyn blinked. "Excuse me." The old woman stepped closer. Her voice trembled. "Where did you get those eyes?" Confusion washed over Evelyn. "I was born with them." The woman's lips parted as though she wanted to say more. Instead, she simply stared. Around them, the city noise faded into the distance. The old woman's eyes shimmered with disbelief, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt as though someone wasn't looking at an orphan Omega. They were looking at a mystery. Finally, the woman took a shaky breath and whispered words that made no sense at all. "No," she said. "That can't be possible. The royal bloodline disappeared 21 years ago." The old woman's words lingered in Evelyn's mind long after she left the square. The royal bloodline disappeared 21 years ago. The sentence repeated itself with every step she took through the busy streets of Moonhaven City. It was absurd, ridiculous. Royal blood belonged to legends, portraits hanging in palace corridors, and stories told to children before bed. It certainly did not belong to an Omega who rented a tiny attic room above a candle shop and spent most of her days washing linens for wealthy families. Yet something about the woman's reaction unsettled her. It had not looked like confusion. It had looked like recognition. By late afternoon, the city had transformed. Silver banners fluttered from balconies. Crystal lanterns lined the main avenues. Musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies as crowds flowed toward the palace district. The Moon Festival had begun. Evelyn adjusted the basket balanced against her hip and hurried through the growing crowd. Unlike everyone else attending the celebration, she was working. The palace kitchens had hired dozens of temporary servants for the evening festivities, and she desperately needed the extra money. Especially now. 1 month. That was all the time she had before relocation. She pushed the thought aside and entered the palace through the service gate. The contrast was overwhelming. Marble floors gleamed beneath golden chandeliers. Massive windows reflected the colors of sunset. Everywhere she looked, nobles moved through the halls dressed in embroidered fabrics worth more than she earned in a year. Evelyn lowered her eyes and focused on her duties. Invisible people survived by remaining invisible. For a while, it worked. She delivered trays, refilled glasses, cleared tables. No one paid attention to her. Then she heard laughter. Not the warm kind. The sharp kind that always seemed aimed at someone. Evelyn glanced up and immediately regretted it. Lady Victoria Ashcroft stood nearby, surrounded by several young noblewomen. Victoria was beautiful in the way expensive paintings were beautiful. Perfect golden curls. A flawless silver gown. A smile that never reached her eyes. Unfortunately, that smile was now directed at Evelyn. "Well," Victoria said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Look who wandered into the palace." Several guests turned. Evelyn felt heat rise into her cheeks. "I am working, my lady." Victoria stepped closer. Her gaze traveled over Evelyn's plain gray dress and worn shoes. "Working? I thought servants were supposed to blend into the background." Laughter followed. Evelyn remained silent. Experience had taught her that defending herself only encouraged people like Victoria. "Tell me," Victoria continued, "is it true they finally put your name on the relocation list?" The surrounding nobles exchanged amused looks. Someone whispered. Someone else smiled. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She had not expected news to travel this quickly. Victoria tilted her head. "Such a shame. Although I suppose nobody will notice you're gone." More laughter. Evelyn gripped the edge of her basket. Not because she wanted to argue. Because she wanted to leave. Then something unexpected happened. An older nobleman passing through the hall slowed as he looked directly at her. His expression changed instantly. Shock flickered across his face. He stared at her eyes. The same way the old woman had earlier. The same disbelief. The same strange recognition. Before Evelyn could react, the nobleman stumbled to a stop and whispered to himself, "Impossible." Across the grand ballroom, hidden among hundreds of festival guests, another pair of eyes had already noticed the entire exchange. The nobleman's whispered words seemed to vanish beneath the music, yet it settled heavily inside Evelyn's chest. Impossible. It was the second time that day someone had looked at her as though they recognized a ghost. Before she could ask what he meant, the man abruptly lowered his gaze and continued walking, disappearing into the sea of guests. The moment passed. The laughter around Victoria resumed. "See," Victoria said with a dismissive smile. "Even Lord Whitmore looks shocked that someone like you is standing in the royal ballroom." More amusement rippled through the group. Evelyn bowed her head politely and stepped away before anyone could stop her. Her heart was beating faster now, not because of the humiliation. She had endured that her entire life. It was the strange reactions. The old woman in the city square. The nobleman in the ballroom. Both had stared at her eyes. Both had looked frightened. She carried an empty tray toward the service corridor, eager to escape the attention. But the palace was growing crowded. The Moon Festival had reached its peak. Hundreds of guests filled the enormous hall beneath glittering chandeliers. Silver lanterns floated near the vaulted ceiling like captured stars. Music echoed from a live orchestra positioned along the western wall. Every noble family in the kingdom seemed to be present. Then suddenly the atmosphere changed. It happened so quickly that Evelyn felt it before she understood it. Conversations softened. Laughter faded. Musicians lowered their instruments. A wave of anticipation swept through the ballroom. Every eye turned toward the grand staircase overlooking the hall. Evelyn glanced up. The Alpha King had arrived. Damien Blackthorne descended the marble steps with calm confidence. He wore a formal black coat trimmed in silver, the royal crest embroidered across one shoulder. His dark hair framed sharp features that appeared carved from stone. Yet it was not his appearance that commanded attention. It was his presence. The room seemed smaller around him. More focused. More alert. Powerful alphas straightened instinctively. Noble women lowered their eyes. Even the servants paused. Evelyn quickly looked away and continued toward the corridor. People like her did not belong in the king's world. Yet as she moved through the crowd, an elderly servant carrying a stack of crystal glasses suddenly lost her balance. One glass slipped from the tray. Then another. Gasps rose nearby. The woman stumbled, struggling to regain control. Without thinking, Evelyn rushed forward. She set down her tray and caught several glasses before they struck the floor. The elderly servant looked terrified. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I should not have accepted such a heavy load." "You are fine," Evelyn said gently. "Let me help you." Together they steadied the tray. The woman's trembling hands slowly relaxed. "Thank you, dear." Evelyn smiled. Of course. It was a small moment, barely noticeable amid the grandeur of the festival. Most guests never saw it, but one person did. Across the ballroom, Damien Blackthorne had stopped walking. While nobles competed for his attention and influential families prepared formal introductions, his gaze had settled elsewhere. Not on the wealthiest woman in the room, not on the most powerful alpha, on a quiet Omega helping an elderly servant. Something about her caught his attention immediately. The kindness seemed genuine, unforced, familiar somehow. Damien frowned slightly. He had never seen her before, yet for reasons he could not explain, he found himself watching as she disappeared into the service corridor. And for the first time that evening, the Alpha King lost interest in everyone else in the room. The rest of the evening should have passed like every other day in Evelyn Hart's life. Quietly, unnoticed, forgotten among hundreds of faces moving through the palace halls. Instead, a strange feeling followed her wherever she went. It began as a faint awareness she could not explain. Every time she entered a room, someone seemed to pause. Every time she looked up, she caught an unfamiliar expression on a stranger's face. Not contempt, not pity, something else, something closer to confusion. As midnight approached, the festival grew even more magnificent. The final celebration was about to begin in the Grand Moon Gallery, the oldest chamber in the royal palace. Servants rushed through corridors carrying trays of food, crystal pitchers, and ceremonial decorations. Evelyn balanced a basket of fresh linens against her hip as she hurried toward the gallery. She had almost reached the entrance when a voice called out, "You there?" "Stop for a moment." Evelyn turned. An elderly man stood beside one of the massive marble columns. He wore deep blue formal robes decorated with silver embroidery. His age was obvious, but there was intelligence in his sharp gray eyes. Evelyn immediately recognized him. Professor Alden Hawthorne, the royal historian, one of the kingdom's most respected scholars. "Yes, sir?" she asked politely. The professor stared at her face. More specifically, her eyes. The same reaction again. The same unsettling silence. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "Have we met before?" she asked. Professor Hawthorne blinked as though waking from a dream. "No." His voice sounded distracted. "No, we have not." He stepped closer. "Tell me, child, do you know anything about your family?" Evelyn hesitated. "Not much. Your parents. They died when I was very young. Any relatives?" She shook her head. "None that I know of." The professor's gaze lowered. Something hidden beneath the collar of her dress had caught his attention. A thin silver chain. Evelyn wore it every day. It was the only thing left from her mother. The professor pointed carefully. "May I see that pendant?" Evelyn instinctively touched the necklace. The small silver charm rested against her chest beneath the fabric. It was old and slightly worn. Nothing special. At least that was what she had always believed. Of course. She carefully lifted the pendant into view. The moment the silver charm appeared, Professor Hawthorne froze. His eyes widened. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then all color seemed to drain from his face. "Impossible," he whispered. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "What is it?" The professor looked around quickly to ensure nobody else was listening. "Where did you get this?" "It belonged to my mother." "Your mother gave this to you?" "Yes." His hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the pendant without touching it. Engraved on the surface was a delicate symbol Evelyn had seen thousands of times, but never understood. A crescent moon surrounding a small star. The professor swallowed hard. "This crest disappeared 21 years ago." Evelyn stared at him. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the gallery doors opened. Guests began entering for the final royal ceremony. The noise of the crowd filled the corridor. Professor Hawthorne immediately stepped back. His expression shifted from shock to caution. "Not here," he said quietly. "There are too many people." "Professor, what is happening?" He looked directly into her eyes. "Child, if that pendant is authentic, then everything the kingdom believes about its history may be wrong." Across the room, standing among nobles and dignitaries, Damien Blackthorne watched the conversation unfold. He could not hear the words, but he saw the historian's reaction. And for the first time that evening, the Alpha King's curiosity became something far more dangerous. Suspicion. The celebration continued around them, but Evelyn barely heard the music anymore. Professor Hawthorne's words echoed through her thoughts with unsettling clarity. Everything the kingdom believes about its history may be wrong. The sentence felt impossible, yet the fear in the old historian's eyes had been real. Before she could ask another question, a group of nobles entered the corridor, forcing them apart. The professor immediately straightened his posture and lowered his voice. "Say nothing about this pendant to anyone." Evelyn stared at him. "Why?" "Because if I am correct, people will begin asking questions that some individuals have spent 21 years trying to avoid." He hesitated before adding, "Meet me tomorrow morning at the Royal Archives. Use the eastern entrance. Do not tell anyone where you are going." Then he stepped away and disappeared into the crowd before she could respond. Evelyn remained frozen for several seconds. Her hand instinctively closed around the silver pendant hanging from her neck. For the first time in her life, she wondered whether it was more than a keepsake. Across the Grand Moon Gallery, Damien Blackthorne watched the exchange carefully. He had spent years studying people. Kings survived by noticing what others ignored. Tonight, 3 separate individuals had reacted to the same servant girl with unmistakable shock. First an elderly woman, then Lord Whitmore, now the kingdom's most respected historian. That was not coincidence. Something was hidden beneath the surface. Something important. Damien's silver eyes followed Evelyn as she slipped quietly through the ballroom. He noticed the way she avoided attention, the way she moved with gentle confidence despite the ridicule directed toward her earlier. Most people seeking power demanded to be seen. She seemed determined to disappear. That alone made her unusual. Nearby, one of his advisors approached. "Your Majesty." Damien glanced toward him. "Find out who she is." The advisor followed his gaze toward Evelyn. "The servant?" "Yes." Immediately, the advisor bowed and departed. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned to her duties, though concentration became impossible. Every task felt distant. Every conversation blurred together. Her thoughts remained trapped between unanswered questions. Who had her parents really been? Why had complete strangers reacted to her eyes? Why did a simple pendant frighten respected nobles? Near midnight, the final ceremony began. Hundreds of guests gathered around the central platform beneath a massive stained glass dome. Moonlight filtered through silver and blue glass, bathing the gallery in soft colors. Damien stepped onto the platform as tradition required. The crowd fell silent. Evelyn watched from the far edge of the room beside other servants. The Alpha King spoke briefly about unity, prosperity, and the future of the kingdom. His voice carried easily across the chamber. Calm, confident, commanding. Yet halfway through his speech, his gaze shifted. For the briefest moment, his eyes found hers across the crowded hall. Evelyn quickly looked away. Her pulse jumped unexpectedly. It made no sense. Kings did not notice girls like her. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the room. Nobles resumed their conversations. Musicians began playing again. The festival slowly moved toward its conclusion. Then a palace messenger entered through the northern doors. He crossed the room quickly and stopped beside Professor Hawthorne. The old historian read the message and visibly paled. Damien noticed immediately. So did Evelyn. The professor's hands trembled as he folded the paper. For a moment, his eyes searched the room until they landed on her. Fear flashed across his face. Real fear. Then he whispered 4 words she could read from across the gallery. They found the records. And suddenly, whatever mystery had been sleeping for 21 years no longer seemed buried at all. Sleep never came easily that night. Evelyn lay awake in her small attic room above the candle shop, staring at the wooden ceiling while moonlight spilled across the floorboards. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same things. Professor Hawthorne's frightened expression, the royal pendant resting against her chest, the messenger's arrival, and those 4 words. They found the records. By dawn, exhaustion had settled over her like a heavy blanket. Yet she rose anyway. The city was unusually quiet as she crossed the empty streets toward the Royal Archives. Morning mist drifted between stone buildings, softening the edges of the capital. Few people were awake. Fewer still noticed the young Omega moving quickly toward the eastern side of the palace complex. The archives occupied one of the oldest structures in Moonhaven. Tall stone walls surrounded the building, and narrow windows overlooked carefully maintained gardens. Evelyn arrived precisely when the city clock struck 8. Professor Hawthorne was already waiting beside a side entrance. He looked older than he had the night before. More worried. More tired. "Come inside," he said quietly. "We do not have much time." Evelyn followed him through rows of towering shelves filled with ancient books, scrolls, and records dating back centuries. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. The silence felt sacred. Eventually, they reached a private study hidden deep within the archive. Several documents had been spread across a large oak table. Professor Hawthorne closed the door behind them. "What did you mean when you said they found the records?" Evelyn asked immediately. The historian took a slow breath. 21 years ago, a fire destroyed part of the royal record collection. Evelyn frowned. Destroyed. That is what everyone believed. He placed a faded document in front of her. Yesterday, workers discovered a sealed storage chamber hidden behind a collapsed wall. Inside were records thought to be lost forever. Evelyn stared at the yellowed pages. "And they mention me?" "Not by name." His expression darkened. "But they mention a child." He carefully unfolded another document. The royal seal was visible at the top. 21 years ago, Queen Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Everyone knew that story. The royal infant had supposedly died shortly after birth. It was one of the kingdom's great tragedies. "The records say she died," Evelyn whispered. Professor Hawthorne nodded slowly. "That is what the public was told." He slid a second page across the table. "This document says something different." Evelyn lowered her gaze and began reading. The words seemed to blur together at first. Then one sentence became clear. The child was removed from the palace under secret protection. Evelyn's breath caught. Removed? Yes. Protected from what? The professor looked toward the closed door as if afraid someone might overhear. "That part is missing." Silence filled the room. Evelyn felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears. None of this could be real. None of it made sense. Then the professor reached into a small wooden box and removed a painted portrait. He placed it gently on the table. Evelyn looked down. The woman in the painting wore a silver crown and a pale blue gown. Her expression was kind. Her eyes were unmistakable. The same unusual shade of blue-gray that stared back at Evelyn from every mirror she had ever known. The same eyes strangers kept recognizing. The same eyes that belonged to Queen Eleanor. For several long seconds, Evelyn could not speak. She simply stared at the portrait resting on the oak table. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same eyes. The same shape of her face. Even the faint curve of the smile felt strangely familiar. A chill moved through her. "No," she whispered. "There has to be another explanation." Professor Hawthorne looked heartbroken. "I hoped there would be." Evelyn lowered herself into a chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked between the portrait and the scattered documents. "You are telling me that the daughter everyone believed died may have survived. That is what the records suggest. And you think that child was me?" The historian did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened a small leather folder and carefully removed another document. "I think this will answer that question better than I can." Evelyn accepted the page. It contained a detailed inventory created by palace officials 21 years earlier. Most of the entries meant nothing to her until her eyes reached the final line. "Infant princess. Identifying heirloom transferred with child. Silver pendant bearing mooncrest seal." Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. Her hand instinctively moved to the necklace resting against her chest. The pendant. The same pendant her mother had left her. The same pendant that had drawn so many strange reactions. The room seemed to spin. "This cannot be real," she said quietly. "I am nobody." Professor Hawthorne's expression softened. "That is exactly what someone wanted the kingdom to believe." Before Evelyn could respond, hurried footsteps echoed outside the study. The door opened suddenly. Both turned. A palace guard entered and bowed respectfully. "Professor Hawthorne, His Majesty requests your immediate presence." The historian frowned. "Now." Immediately. The guard glanced toward Evelyn. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across his face. Then it disappeared. Hawthorne slowly gathered the documents. "It seems the king has questions." Evelyn stood. "Should I leave?" "No." The professor looked thoughtful. "In fact, I believe you should come with me." 20 minutes later, Evelyn found herself walking through sections of the royal palace she had never seen before. The halls were quieter here. more private. Sunlight streamed through towering windows overlooking royal gardens. Everything felt unreal. Eventually, they reached a large chamber lined with bookshelves and maps. Damien Blackthorne stood near a window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as they entered. His silver eyes immediately settled on Evelyn. Not with judgment, not with pity, with careful attention. The kind that made her feel as though he was searching for answers hidden beneath the surface. "Professor," Damien said calmly, "you received the recovered records." "Yes, Your Majesty." And silence filled the room. Hawthorne exchanged a glance with Evelyn before speaking. "The evidence is becoming difficult to ignore." Damien's gaze never left her. "Explain." The historian carefully presented the documents. One by one. The pendant, the hidden records, the missing child, the royal inventory, the queen's portrait. Each revelation deepened the silence in the room. When he finished, nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, Damien walked toward Evelyn. She felt her heartbeat quicken. The Alpha King stopped a few feet away. "What did you believe your future would be yesterday?" he asked unexpectedly. Evelyn blinked. "Yesterday?" "Yes." She thought of the relocation notice, the tiny attic room, the life she had always known. "I thought I would disappear," she admitted softly. Damien studied her for a moment. Then he looked toward the portrait Professor Hawthorne had brought with them. His expression became unreadable. That may no longer be possible. At that exact moment, another palace official rushed into the chamber carrying a sealed letter. He looked pale, nervous. "Your Majesty," he said breathlessly, "more records have been recovered." Damien accepted the letter and broke the seal. His eyes moved across the page. Then for the first time since Evelyn had met him, genuine shock appeared on his face. "What is it?" Professor Hawthorne asked. Damien slowly lowered the document. "The records contain a name." His gaze lifted toward Evelyn. Not just the lost princess. The room seemed to hold its breath. They contained the name of the woman who raised her. The room remained silent after Damien's revelation. Evelyn felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted once again. A name. The records contained the name of the woman who had raised the missing child. The woman she had called mother. The woman she barely remembered. Damien placed the document carefully on the table. "Read it," he said softly. Evelyn stepped forward. Her eyes moved across the faded handwriting. At first she could not process the words. Then she saw it. Margaret Hart. Her breath caught. The name stared back at her from the page. The same name written on the small grave marker outside Moonhaven. The same woman who had sung her to sleep when she was little. The same woman who had worked endless hours to provide a simple life for a child she had never once treated as anything less than precious. Tears blurred Evelyn's vision. "It is her," she whispered. Professor Hawthorne nodded. "Your mother was listed as the child's guardian." Evelyn swallowed hard. Then she knew. Most likely. The realization settled heavily inside her chest. All those years. All those unanswered questions. Somehow Margaret Hart had carried a secret large enough to change the kingdom. Yet she had never revealed it. Not even when illness took her. Not even when they struggled to survive. Damien studied Evelyn carefully. He could see grief mixing with confusion. But something else stood out more. She was not asking about titles. Not asking about wealth. Not asking about power. The first thing she cared about was the woman who raised her. That observation stayed with him. Before anyone could speak again, another knock sounded at the chamber door. A royal aide entered and bowed. "Your Majesty, the council has been informed." Damien's expression hardened slightly. "Already. News is spreading quickly." The aide hesitated. "Several noble families are demanding clarification." Professor Hawthorne sighed heavily. "I was afraid of that." Within an hour, the palace seemed transformed. Whispers traveled through corridors. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Advisors hurried between meetings. The recovered records had become the only subject anyone discussed. By afternoon, a special gathering was called in the Hall of Judgment. Evelyn had never entered the chamber before. It was enormous. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating rows of seats occupied by nobles, council members, scholars, and palace officials. Every eye turned toward her as she entered. The attention felt overwhelming. Some faces looked curious, others skeptical, a few openly disapproving. Evelyn recognized several people from the festival, including Lady Victoria Ashcroft. The noblewoman's confident smile had vanished entirely. Damien took his place at the front of the hall. Professor Hawthorne stood nearby holding the recovered records. The room quieted immediately. The evidence recovered from the royal archives has been examined, Damien announced. His voice carried easily through the chamber. The findings are significant. Murmurs spread across the audience. Hawthorne presented the documents one by one. The pendant inventory, the sealed records, the testimony connecting Margaret Hart to the missing child. Each piece strengthened the same conclusion. As the evidence accumulated, the mood in the room shifted. Doubt slowly gave way to disbelief. Then disbelief gave way to something even greater. Recognition. Finally, Professor Hawthorne unfolded the last document. There is no reasonable dispute remaining. His voice trembled slightly. The child removed from the palace 21 years ago survived. Complete silence followed. Every person in the hall seemed afraid to breathe. Hawthorne looked directly at Evelyn. And that child is Evelyn Hart. The words echoed through the chamber. No applause followed. No celebration. Only stunned silence. Evelyn stood frozen. For years, she had been invisible. Forgotten. Overlooked. Yet now hundreds of people stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. And among them, the Alpha King never looked away. The silence inside the Hall of Judgment lasted several seconds longer than anyone expected. Then slowly, one by one, people rose from their seats. Council members, scholars, nobles, palace officials, not because they had been ordered to, because they understood what had just happened. 21 years of history had changed in a single afternoon. Evelyn stood motionless as the room transformed around her. Only days earlier, she had been an overlooked Omega preparing to leave the kingdom without anyone noticing. Now the very people who once ignored her could not look away. The attention felt overwhelming, uncomfortable, unreal. Yet through all of it, her thoughts returned to one person, Margaret Hart, the woman who had raised her, the woman who had chosen kindness over recognition, the woman who had protected a child without asking for anything in return. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes, not because she had gained a title, because she finally understood the sacrifice her mother had made. Damien noticed. While others focused on bloodlines and succession, Evelyn was grieving the woman who had loved her. In that moment, any remaining doubts disappeared. Power could be inherited. Character could not. He stepped forward and addressed the chamber. Today we have recovered more than a missing chapter of history. His voice echoed through the hall. We have recovered the truth. Every eye turned toward him. For 21 years, a child believed she was forgotten. Yet her existence endured. Not because of privilege. Not because of status. Because someone chose courage. Someone chose compassion. He glanced toward Evelyn. And because she grew into exactly the kind of person this kingdom should be proud of. The words settled over the room. Many lowered their eyes. Some remembered seeing her in passing and never offering kindness. Others remembered laughing when they should have listened. Even Lady Victoria Ashcroft sat in complete silence. For the first time, there was no arrogance left on her face. Damien then turned toward Evelyn fully. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn Hart. Her heart pounded. Or perhaps, he continued, Evelyn Mooncrest. The ancient royal surname echoed through the hall. The kingdom recognizes your birthright. He gestured toward the royal standard hanging behind him. But your worth was never created by a title. You possessed it long before any of us knew your name. Evelyn felt emotion tighten her throat. Nobody had ever spoken to her that way before. Not as someone important. As someone seen. Damien took another step forward. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, the Alpha King bowed his head. It was not dramatic. Not theatrical. It was sincere. A gesture of respect. The room gasped softly. Welcome home, he said. Tears finally slipped down Evelyn's cheeks. Not because she had discovered she belonged to royalty. Because after a lifetime of feeling invisible, she finally belonged somewhere. The hall erupted into applause. Warm. Genuine. Unstoppable. Yet even as the celebration began, Professor Hawthorne remained unusually quiet. He was studying a final document recently recovered from the hidden archive. A document nobody else had examined yet. His eyes moved across the faded page. Then suddenly he froze. His expression changed. Slowly, he looked toward Evelyn. Then toward Damien. The color drained from his face. Because buried within the last surviving record was a prophecy written before Evelyn had even been born. And according to the forgotten words preserved for more than 2 decades, The return of the lost princess was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning.